August 1840. 1,000 Comanche warriors charge into southeast Texas, torches blazing, hooves thundering, leaving settlements in ashes. They're not just raiding. They're avenging 33 chiefs gunned down by Texas officials months earlier. In a botched peace talk, historians call it the Great Raid, the biggest native attack on American soil ever. But hold up. Were they bloodthirsty savages? Or a tribe fighting to protect their world from collapsing? Why did they risk it all? And how did they pull off chaos on this scale? Back in the 18th century, the southern Great Plains belonged to a tribe called the Comanche. They were a North American Indian group known for two big things: riding horses better than anyone, and living a nomadic life that kept them on the move. Through the 1700s and 1800s, these guys didn't stay in one place. They roamed across what's now Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, as far south as Durango, following buffalo herds, and taking on anyone who got in their way. Their name comes from a Ute word that means anyone who wants to fight me all the time. And that pretty much sums them up. The Comanche were scrappers, always ready for a fight. And they earned that reputation over years. They didn't start out on the plains, though. They were originally part of the Shoshone tribe up in Wyoming. Sometime in the early 1700s, they broke off and started heading south. Not all at once, but in stages. Pushing out tribes like the Apache started shrinking. By the time they settled in, they'd taken over, running the show for more than 150 years. People started calling them the Suxi, lords of the southern plains, because they owned that land in every way that mattered. Around the early 1800s, they hit their stride. Their population was somewhere between 7,000 and 30,000, which made them a serious force out there. They weren't the only ones on the plains, though. They shared parts of their territory, a chunk called Comanche, with tribes like the Wichita, Kiowa, and Kiowa Apache. After 1840, the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho moved in too. Sometimes they got along, traded, or even teamed up. But the Comanche were the ones everyone kept an eye on. They had the numbers and the skills to stay in charge. How'd they operate? They spoke a northern Uto-Aztecan language, which was kind of a common lingo in that region, tying them to other tribes around them. They didn't have one big leader or a central setup like some groups. Instead, they split into bands, small crews based on family and loyalty. Each band handled its own business, but when it was time to hunt or fight, they'd link up quick. That setup kept them flexible and hard to track. Their whole life was tied to buffalo. Those herds were their grocery store and hardware shop rolled into one. They used the hides for teepee covers, ate the meat, and turned the fat into tallow for all kinds of uses. If the buffalo moved, the Comanche moved too, and they could because of their horses. They picked up horses from the Spanish in the late 1600s and turned them into a game changer. They didn't just ride them. They bred them, trained them, made them the heart of everything they did. By the 18th century, that horse know-how set them apart from other plains tribes. It's what let them chase buffalo, cover ground fast, and pull off raids that left people stunned. Here's the deal with the Comanche. They weren't just getting by. They were calling the shots, chasing power and freedom every step of the way. They had this deep tie to the land. That wasn't just talk. It was how they lived. It drove their raids, their wars, everything they were about. They turned into a crew that settlers, soldiers, and other tribes couldn't ignore. A force that shook up the American West. The Comanche built their entire existence around the buffalo. And it's easy to see why. When you think about how much they relied on it, they turned the hides into tough, weatherproof teepee covers that shielded them from the brutal winds and scorching sun as they roamed the southern Great Plains. The meat became their main source of food, providing the protein they needed to keep up their fast-paced, nomadic lifestyle across vast stretches of land. Even the fat had a purpose. They'd render it down into tallow, which they used for cooking, or rubbed on their skin to protect against the elements. For the Comanche, buffalo weren't just animals. They were the foundation of their economy, shaping where they traveled and how they managed to thrive in such a challenging environment. Horses were a game changer for the Comanche, and their story with them starts way back in the late 1600s. When they first got their hands on some from Spanish settlers, they didn't stop at riding. They bred those horses, carefully selecting for speed and stamina to create mounts perfectly suited for the plains. By the 18th century, this had evolved into a full-blown equestrian culture that set the standard for plains tribes and gave the Comanche an edge over everyone else. Picture a warrior tearing across the open land, perfectly in sync with his horse, moving so fast and fluidly that they seemed like one unstoppable force. Horses didn't just make them mobile, they handed them power and the ability to dominate a region that stretched hundreds of miles, all while living on their own terms. Language played a big role in keeping the Comanche connected, and they spoke a northern Uto Aztecan tongue that doubled as a kind of regional lingua franca. It wasn't just for them. It let them talk to other tribes, whether they were trading goods like buffalo hides or negotiating after a raid. Their social structure was just as practical, built around small, autonomous bands, tied together by family and loyalty, rather than some rigid, top-down system. Each band operated independently, making its own calls on where to move or when to fight. But they could unite when the stakes were high. This setup kept them adaptable, letting them scatter across the plains, or come together as a united front whenever they needed to face a bigger challenge. Comanche women were absolutely vital to the tribe's survival, and they did way more than just keep the home fires burning. Though they were masters at that too, they'd sit with the warriors, hashing out strategies for the next raid, bringing insights that turned risky plans into smart ones. Sometimes they'd scout ahead, sneaking through the tall grass to watch enemy movements, then coming back with detailed reports on how many people or horses they'd spotted. When it was time to make decisions, their voices carried weight, helping shape tactics with a keen sense of what could work out there on the plains. Beyond that, they kept the band together through tough times, stretching food supplies, tending to the injured, and holding on to hope when disease or hunger struck. Their resourcefulness and strength were just as critical as any warrior's spear, making them the backbone of a tribe that lived hard and fought harder. This lifestyle wasn't easy or fancy, but it was built to last. In a world that demanded toughness and quick thinking, the buffalo provided the raw materials for food and shelter. Horses gave them the speed to strike and vanish. Their language bridged gaps with neighbors, and those family bands offered a tight-knit strength that held them together. Comanche women tied it all together, turning survival into something more than just getting by. They made it possible for the tribe to roam free, hit hard, and stand tall in a land that was always testing them. That's how the Comanche lived, rooted in the plains, fiercely independent, and ready for whatever came their way. The Comanche knew how to use their horses like no one else, and that's what made their raids so legendary. They'd charge in on these swift mounts, hitting their targets with lightning-quick assaults that left little time for anyone to fight back, then vanish into the wide open plains before anyone could even figure out what happened. These weren't random attacks. They were fast, brutal, and ruthlessly efficient, designed to catch settlers, rival native tribes, and Mexican villagers, completely off guard. Whether it was a lone homestead or a small village, the Comanche would sweep through, strike hard, and disappear, leaving chaos in their wake. It was a style of fighting that turned them into a terror across the frontier, and they perfected it over years of practice and necessity. What they were after in these raids wasn't just chaos, it was practical stuff. They needed to keep their way of life going strong. They targeted material goods, like food, weapons, or tools, anything they could carry off to sustain their bands. Horses were a huge prize too, since their whole culture revolved around them, and they'd grab as many as they could to bolster their herds. Captives were another goal, people they could ransom off, or sometimes even bring into the tribe, especially women and children, who might end up staying for good. Their reach was incredible. They'd ride over 1,000 miles south, from their heartland in the southern Great Plains, all the way down to Durango, Mexico, hitting targets far beyond what anyone thought possible. That kind of range showed just how fearless and determined they were to protect their territory and way of life. Their precision and skill didn't come out of nowhere. It was rooted in two things: their unmatched horsemanship and a bond with the land that went deep. Those horses weren't just transportation. They were partners, trained to move fast and turn on a dime, letting warriors weave through fights with deadly accuracy. A Comanche rider could lean low, fire arrows or a gun mid-gallop, and be gone before the dust settled, all thanks to years of living in the saddle. Then there was their knowledge of the plains. Every dip, ridge, and water source mapped in their heads, giving them the edge to plan ambushes or escape routes that left pursuers lost. This connection to the land wasn't just about survival. It was about securing resources and defending their homeland against anyone who threatened it, whether that was rival tribes or encroaching settlers. The people who felt the sting of these raids were a mixed bunch, and the Comanche didn't discriminate much. When it came to their targets, Anglo-American settlers in Texas were prime victims, especially as more of them pushed into Comanche territory during the 19th century, building farms and towns where the tribe once roamed free. Hispanic communities in Mexico got hit hard too, with villages along the border and even deeper south bearing the brunt of those long-distance raids. Other native tribes weren't safe either, like the Apache, who'd been shoved out of the southern plains earlier when the Comanche rolled in and took over. These attacks weren't personal. They were strategic, aimed at keeping the Comanche strong and their enemies weak, whether that meant stealing horses from a settler's barn, looting a Mexican village, or pushing back a rival tribe, trying to reclaim old ground. This raiding style was pure Comanche, a mix of speed, skill, and survival. That made them a force to be reckoned with. They turned their horses into weapons, used the plains like a shield, and hit hard to keep their people fed, mobile, and free. It wasn't pretty, and it sure wasn't gentle, but it worked, keeping them in control of their world for over a century. That's the art of the Comanche raid: practical, precise, and powerful enough to echo through history. The Comanche Wars stretched from 1706 to 1875, a staggering 169 years of conflict. That began when the Comanche first raided Spanish colonies in New Mexico and didn't end until their final surrender to U.S. forces. It all started with those early strikes against Spanish outposts, like the one reported in 1706, when Comanche warriors hit settlements near Taos, testing their strength against European powers, encroaching on their northern borders. The wars peaked in the 1840s, a decade when their raids reached an astonishing scale, tearing through Mexico, as far south as Durango, and hammering Texas with relentless fury. This wasn't just about fighting. It was a desperate struggle over land and survival, fueled by territorial disputes, as outsiders carved up the Comanche area, and resource competition, as settlers and soldiers hunted the buffalo herds the Comanche depended on. They faced off against Spanish troops in the early days, then Mexican forces after Mexico's independence in 1821, and finally American settlers and military units as the U.S. pushed west. In the 19th century, each clash built their reputation as the fiercest warriors of the Southern Plains, a legacy forged in blood and defiance. Leading this long resistance were towering figures like Quanah Parker, Buffalo Hump, Peta Nocona, Eagle's Head, Iron Jacket, and 10 Bears, men who became legends for their courage and cunning. Quanah Parker, born around 1845 to Cynthia Ann Parker and Peta Nocona, would later emerge as a key leader in the 1870s, bridging the old warrior ways with a new reality. Buffalo Hump, active in the 1830s and 1840s, was a war chief who orchestrated massive retaliatory raids, while Peta Nocona, active from the 1830s to 1860s, led with a quiet ferocity that made him a feared name among settlers. Eagle's Head and Iron Jacket brought their own fierce resistance. In the 1850s, the latter famously wearing a Spanish mail shirt that made him seem invincible, until he fell in 1858. 10 Bears, a diplomat as much as a warrior, spoke for peace in the 1860s, but stood firm when words failed. These leaders drove their people against wave after wave of enemies, motivated by the need to protect their nomadic lifestyle and the vast plains they called home, a region stretching from modern-day Oklahoma to northern Mexico. Their fight wasn't just physical, it was a refusal to let their world be swallowed up by colonial powers. One of the first major flashpoints came on May 19, 1836, with the Fort Parker Massacre in what's now Limestone County, Texas. A coalition of Comanches, alongside Kiowas, Caddos, and Wichitas, stormed the small settlement, killing 5 settlers in a brutal assault that shocked the frontier. They captured several people that day, including 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker, who'd grow up Comanche, and Mary Peta Nocona, bearing him Quanah and others. Other captives included her brother John Richard Parker, 17-year-old Rachel Plummer, and her son James Pratt Plummer, and Elizabeth Judy Kellogg, who was later reunited with her sister Martha in 1836. This raid wasn't just violence, it was a grim signal of the escalating tensions between settlers and tribes, a chapter that saw captives like Cynthia Ann woven into Comanche society, shaping their future in unexpected ways. Things got uglier with the Council House fight on March 19, 1840, in San Antonio. It started as a peace talk, with 33 Comanche leaders meeting Texas officials to negotiate over captives, including Texans and Mexicans held by the tribe. The Comanche wanted their land, the Comancheria, recognized, but Texas demanded all white hostages returned. When the delegation brought only one captive, 16-year-old Matilda Lockhart, who'd been badly treated, talks broke down fast. A scuffle turned deadly, and by the end, 12 Comanche leaders lay dead inside the council house, with 23 more shot outside, alongside 7 Texans killed and 10 wounded. This betrayal lit a fire under the Comanche, exposing the deep mistrust and miscommunication that defined these clashes. That fury exploded into the Great Raid of 1840, launched in August. After the Council House disaster, Buffalo Hump rallied 1,000 warriors from various bands, striking deep into southeast Texas in retaliation for their 33 slain chiefs. Starting on August 6, they hit Victoria and Linville, burning settlements and looting supplies, driven by rage over the broken truce and the demand for more hostages. Like Matilda Lockhart, it was the largest native raid on white settlements in U.S. history, covering over 300 miles and leaving dozens dead, a raw display of Comanche power and vengeance. The response came fast, with the Battle of Plum Creek on August 12, 1840, near Lockhart, Texas. Those 1,000 warriors clashed with Texas Rangers and militia, led by Edward Burleson and Matthew Caldwell. The Rangers claimed 80 Comanche kills, but only 12 bodies were found, while the Comanche reported 11 Ranger deaths, leaving historians arguing over the real toll. It was a chaotic, inconclusive fight that showed how hard it was to pin the Comanche down. The Antelope Hills Expedition, running from January to May 1858, brought the U.S. military into the fray, led by the 2nd Cavalry, under Captain Earl Van Dorn. 220 troops, backed by Tonkawa, Nodoko, and Shawnee allies, targeted Pettinocona and Iron Jacket's forces. In the Comancheria, on May 12, they hit a camp near the Canadian River, killing 76 Comanches, capturing 16, and losing 50 soldiers. In the process, Iron Jacket fell that day, his mail shirt no match for a barrage of bullets. That same day, the Battle of Little Robe Creek unfolded nearby, with Texas Rangers under John Ford and 113 Allied warriors surprising another Comanche camp. In 3 fierce engagements, they killed 76 Comanches and captured over 60, losing just 2 Rangers and 5 wounded. It was a devastating blow, proving the Rangers could strike deep into Comanche territory. On December 18, 1860, the Battle of Pease River hit in Ford County, Texas, sparked by Comanche raids in November. That killed 6 settlers and stole livestock across Parker, Young, Jack, and Palo Pinto counties. Local citizens, reinforced by Texas Rangers under Lawrence Sullivan Sull Ross, attacked a village, killing 12 Comanches. In a 20 to 30-minute skirmish, they recaptured Cynthia Ann Parker, now 33, her daughter Topsana Prairie Flower, and a boy named Pease Ross, ending her 24 years with the tribe. In a sudden, bittersweet reunion, the first Battle of Adobe Walls followed, or a small village near the Canadian River, where over 1,000 Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache warriors faced Kit Carson's 335 U.S. troops. The fight dragged on for hours, nearly exhausting Carson's ammunition, with 60 native casualties and 6 soldiers dead, a testament to the Comanches' stubborn endurance. The end came with the Red River War in 1874, when the Comanche population had dwindled to 3,000, with only 1,000 still nomadic and 300 fit to fight. Starting in June, they allied with Kiowa, Apache, and Southern Cheyenne bands, clashing with U.S. forces. In the Texas Panhandle, General Ranald Mackenzie led 46 companies, some 3,000 troops, the largest force ever sent, against native tribes, targeting their camps. On September 28, 1874, at Palo Duro Canyon, Mackenzie's surprise attack destroyed villages, killed few, but captured 1,424 horses, slaughtering most, to cripple the Comanches' mobility. By June 2, 1875, Quanah Parker and the last holdouts surrendered at Fort Sill, ending the wars. These clashes, from 1706 to 1875, were epic, chaotic, and defining, a saga of power and loss that reshaped the Southwest forever. The Comanche Empire didn't crumble overnight. It was a slow, brutal unraveling that hit them from every angle. In the 19th century, one of the biggest blows came from diseases like cholera and smallpox, epidemics that tore through their camps with devastating speed. Smallpox hit hard in waves, with a major outbreak in 1816, cutting their numbers, followed by cholera in 1849. That killed hundreds, maybe thousands, in a matter of weeks. These weren't just illnesses. They were population killers, wiping out warriors in their prime and leaving bands without the manpower to raid or defend themselves. By the 1860s, their once mighty military strength, which had peaked, with an estimated 7,000 to 30,000 people, in the early 1800s, was fading fast. Families mourned their losses, and the tribe's ability to strike fear into settlers and rival tribes weakened as their numbers shrank, leaving them vulnerable in ways they'd never been before against European powers. The relentless push of U.S. westward expansion, which started gaining steam in the 1830s and never let up. It began with settlers trickling into Texas after Mexico opened the region to American colonists in 1821. But by the time Texas joined the U.S. in 1845, the floodgates were open. The Comancheria, that vast stretch of plains from modern-day Oklahoma down to northern Mexico, started shrinking as homesteaders, ranchers, and towns sprang up where buffalo once roamed free. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge in 1867 tried to box them into a reservation in Indian Territory, but many refused, clinging to their nomadic life. Still, by the 1870s, they were being squeezed into smaller, resource-poor pockets of land, places where water was scarce and game was harder to find. This wasn't just losing territory, it was losing the freedom and abundance that defined who they were, forcing them into a corner with fewer options. Every year, the bison herds, the lifeblood of their culture, took a catastrophic hit, starting in the 1860s. And that was a wound they couldn't recover from. These massive animals provided meat for food, hides for tippies and clothing, and bones for tools, everything the Comanche needed to keep moving and thriving. But as settlers poured in, overhunting exploded, especially after the Civil War, when buffalo hunters, armed with high-powered rifles, flooded the plains. By 1870, the herds that once numbered in the millions were dropping fast, with estimates showing only a few 100,000 left. By the mid-1870s, habitat loss made it worse, as railroads, like the Kansas Pacific, completed in 1867, cut through the plains, splitting migration routes and opening the land to more slaughter for the Comanche. This was a slow starvation, their traditional lifestyle, buckling under the strain of empty hunts and dwindling supplies, leaving them scrambling to adapt to a world without their cornerstone resource. The Red River War in 1874 was the final nail in the coffin, a crushing campaign that broke their resistance once and for all. By then, their population was down to about 3,000, with only 1,000 still living the nomadic life, and maybe 300 warriors left to fight. It started in June 1874, when Comanche bands, alongside Kiowa, Apache, and Southern Cheyenne allies, clashed with buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls on June 27, losing 15 warriors. In a failed attack, the U.S. responded with overwhelming force, sending 46 companies, roughly 3,000 troops, under General Ranald Mackenzie, to hunt them down. The decisive blow came on September 28, 1874, at the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon, in the Texas Panhandle. Mackenzie's men caught the Comanche off guard, burning villages and supplies, killing few, but capturing 1,424 horses, then slaughtering most of them, to cripple the tribe's mobility. With their resources torched and their horses gone, the Comanche had no choice but to surrender. By June 2, 1875, Quanah Parker led the last holdouts to Fort Sill, accepting reservation life. A handful of warriors refused to give up, carrying the fight into the Buffalo Hunters' War of 1876 and 1877. A last gasp, a flicker of defiance from a people whose era of dominance had ended. Epidemics gutted their numbers. Expansion stole their land. The bison's collapse starved their culture. The Red River War shattered their strength. From lords of the plains to a tribe on the ropes, the Comanche's fall was a stark, painful shift, closing a chapter that had shaped the American West. For over a century, the Comanche left a deep imprint on the American Southwest. Their raids did more than just scare settlers. They shaped how the U.S. dealt with native tribes. Back in 1830, their relentless attacks were part of the chaos that pushed Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, signed by President Andrew Jackson on May 28. This law forced tribes east of the Mississippi to relocate, but it set a tone for handling tribes like the Comanche too, paving the way for the reservation system that took hold later as Comanche warriors struck Texas settlements and Mexican villages. Through the 1840s and 1850s, they challenged the whole idea of westward expansion, making it clear this land wasn't free for the taking. Settlers fought back, forming vigilante groups like the Texas Rangers, who got their start in 1823 and grew tougher, chasing Comanche raiders. The U.S. Army built forts, like Fort Sill in Oklahoma, established in 1869, to shield pioneers and box in the Comanche, turning their resistance into a catalyst for military and policy shifts that defined the frontier. That 170-year struggle, from their first raids on Spanish New Mexico in 1706 to their surrender in 1875, wasn't just a series of battles. It was a loud, defiant stand against colonial powers. They took on Spain until its grip on the region weakened by 1821, then Mexico through the 1830s and 1840s, and finally the United States as it muscled west after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848. Each fight left scars on the land and the people, from burned-out settlements in Texas to ravaged villages in northern Mexico, cementing the Comanche as symbols of raw, unyielding resistance. Their hit-and-run tactics and horsemanship kept them in control of the southern plains for over a century, forcing every power that came their way to reckon with a tribe that wouldn't bend. Even as their empire fell, that legacy stuck, a reminder of a time when the Comanche held the West in awe and fear, shaping its history as much as any settler or soldier. Today, the Comanche aren't just a memory, they're a living culture, thanks to efforts that kicked into gear in the late 20th century. After decades on reservations, like the one near Lawton, Oklahoma, where many settled post-1875, their descendants started reclaiming what was nearly lost. Powwows became a big part of that, vibrant gatherings where Comanche people of all ages come together, like the annual Comanche Nation Fair, held every September. Since the 1990s, you'll see traditional dances there, like the gourd dance, with its steady drum beats and swaying steps, passed down from warriors to today's youth. Storytelling keeps the past alive too, with elders sharing tales of Buffalo Hump or Quanah Parker around fires or in community centers, making sure kids know where they come from. These aren't just events, they're a way to heal, connect, and keep the Comanche spirit breathing in a modern world. Education's another piece of this revival, with initiatives that started picking up in the 1970s and 1980s to spotlight the Comanche's historical weight. The Comanche Nation itself runs programs like language classes, teaching that northern Uto Aztec tongue, nearly lost to time, with efforts ramping up after a 1994 tribal resolution to preserve it. Museums and schools in Oklahoma and Texas, they were partners, not just as a footnote, but as a cornerstone of the Southwest story, often with exhibits on raids like the Great Raid of 1840 or the Red River War. Tribal members work with historians too, publishing books and giving talks, ensuring that warrior spirit, the grit of leaders like Pettinokona, or the resilience of women strategists, lives on in narratives that reach beyond the res. It's a push to show the world that the Comanche aren't gone. They're adapting, teaching, and standing tall, keeping their legacy sharp and proud for generations to come. The Comanche story is nothing short of epic, starting as fearless raiders who commanded the plains from 1706 to 1875, then rising as cultural icons. From the ruins of their past, they redefined the Wild West with their bravery and toughness, proving that their spirit could endure any challenge. This video has been all about showing how their fierce independence and resilience shaped a legendary legacy. If you loved exploring their world with us, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss our next history adventure. Drop a comment below. Which Comanche tale blew you away?